Hey guys, in this video we're going to be doing lesson 5.8, which is on the quadratic formula. And this is the final method that you will be learning that allows you to find x-intercepts. And this method, some people prefer to do quadratic formula every single time because it always works. The other methods don't always work. But sometimes people prefer the other methods because they're kind of like shortcuts. But this is one when nothing else works, at least the quadratic formula will. And so in order to solve using the quadratic formula, you first have to get it in standard form set equal to 0, like this. Okay? And then you have to identify your A, B, and C. So here is the formula. It's x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. Notice I put that b in parentheses. That's important. All over 2a. And then we'll just take it one step at a time and simplify. We are not going to type that thing into the calculator in one step because the calculator, sometimes it won't give you an answer because your answers will be imaginary, like what we learned last lesson, that really tough stuff. Sometimes you'll have to simplify a square root. Your calculator would just give you a decimal, and I don't want your answers left like that. So we take it one step at a time. So let's look at number 1. Go to the side and identify your A, your B, and your C. So your A is 1, your B is 2, and your C is negative 63. So then in the formula, x equals negative b. So it's going to be negative 2 plus or minus the square root of 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 63. All over 2 times 1. Now remember, I just said you're not typing that whole thing in the calculator. The first thing that I want you to type in is this little section that's under the square root. I don't want you to actually use the square root button. Just type in these numbers. Don't hit the square root button. I will say that 10 times, and a third of you will still type in the square root button. You're only typing in the 2 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 63. So we're only simplifying one little bit at a time. So everything else is going to stay the same. So in your calculator, find out what goes under the square root. And you should get 256. Okay? Now if you typed in the square root button, you wouldn't have got 256. You weren't supposed to type in the square root button. All right, and the reason for that is because sometimes it won't be a perfect square. So if you type in the square root button, sometimes you will get a decimal. Now on this one, you wouldn't have, because I'm kind of going in with some of the easier ones first, but I wanted you to see that. All right, so then we're going to simplify the square root. Now, in this case, it's going to give us a whole number, which is nice. The square root of 256 is 16. So notice how I took the square root of 256 and replaced that with 16. If that number that we got was not a perfect square, that's where we would simplify square roots that we learned a few lessons back. Now, look on your calculator really good. Look for a plus or minus button. Look all the buttons. You're not going to find one. What we're doing here is we're going to use a plus sign once and a minus sign once. So we've got -2 plus 16 over 2 and -2 minus 16 over 2. Okay. And so if we type in the first one, -2 plus 16 is 14, divided by 2 is 7. And -2 minus 16 is -18, divided by 2 is -9. So if I were to graph this quadratic, it would cross the x-axis at 7 and at -9. All right, number 2, notice it's not set equal to 0. So we have to get everything on the same side. So if I want to move this 4x over, I have to subtract it from both sides. And we subtract it from where there's like terms. So I'm going to subtract it from the 3x because those are like terms. And the 15, I will add that to both sides. On the left, there isn't just a plain number, so I'm just going to add it out to the end. So it's going to be -2x squared minus 1x, because 3 minus 4 is -1, and then plus 15 equals 0. Okay, and so then my A is going to be -2, B is -1, C is 15. And let's plug those into the formula. So I'm going to have negative, and then my B is -1. That's going to turn into a positive 1. A negative is a positive. So -B plus or minus the square root, my B squared, minus 4 times my A, which is -2, times C, which is 15. And that entire thing is over 2A. So I'm going to, when I rewrite this, I'm going to go ahead and make that a positive 1 plus or minus the square root. And I'm going to figure out what goes under the square root. So in your calculator, go type that, just the numbers. Remember, you don't need to type in the square root button. So just the numbers. And when you type that in, you get 121. And then that's all over -4, because 2 times -2 is -4. All right, so 121 is a perfect square. So we can go ahead and just make that 1 plus or minus 11, because the square root of 121 is 11 over -4. And now we have two simple problems to calculate. We're going to do 1 plus 11, which is 12, divided by -4 is -3. Okay. Now you can type this whole thing in like the fraction. Remember, alpha y equals gives you a fraction, and you could just type 1 plus 11 in the numerator and type in -4 in the denominator. And then you can go do 1 minus 11 over -4. And doing it that way will give you the most simplified form of a fraction. In this case, it's 5/2. Number 3, this one is not set equal to 0, so we have to subtract the 1 from both sides. On the left, there aren't any plain numbers, so when we subtract it, we're really just subtracting it at the end. -x squared plus 2x minus 1 equals 0. So my A is -1. My B is 2, and my C is -1. So we have -2 plus or minus the square root. My B is 2, so B squared, minus 4 times my A, which is -1, times C, which is -1. And that whole thing is over 2 times my A, which is -1. All right, let's simplify. We've got -2 plus or minus the square root. So type in these numbers in your calculator. And you should get 0 all over -2. What is the square root of 0? It's 0 over -2. So if you get 0 there, whether you add 0 or you subtract 0, you're going to get the same answer. So this is one that has only one x-intercept. We're going to have -2 divided by -2, which is 1. If I were to subtract 0, it would still be -2 divided by -2. You don't have to write it twice. Okay, let's go to -4. Or number 4, not -4, sorry. That one is not set equal to 0, so we have to subtract 10x from both sides. And when we do that, we get 8x squared minus 10x equals 0. This one's a little different because there aren't 3 terms. There are only 2. So my A is 8, your B is -10, and your C is 0. Remember, your C is always just the plain number. There's no plain number. X equals -B. So we have -10 plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A, which is 8, times my C, which is 0, all over 2A, which is 8. So when I simplify, we get a +10 plus or minus the square root. Now this time, when you simplify, you should get 100. If you got -100, I guarantee that you did not put parentheses around your -10. You have to put parentheses. And then that's all over 16. Now 100 is a perfect square, so the square root of 100 is 10. All right. 10 plus 10 divided by 16, that is 5/4. You can put that in the fraction in your calculator. It's alpha y equals. And 10 minus 10 is 0, divided by 16 is 0. So these first 4 that we've done have all had perfect squares, and all of our answers have come out as whole numbers or fractions. Those are nice. These next ones we're going to do are a little bit different. So first off, on number 5, we need to get it set equal to 0. So I need to subtract 4x. Now there's not an x on the left side to combine it with, so we're going to write it separate. That one has to go in the middle. You always have to write it with your x squared first, then your x, and then your plain number. Otherwise, your a, b, and c might get mixed up. So my a is 1, b is -4, and c is -9. So we have put x equals. It's negative, and then -4, plus or minus the square root of -4 squared, make sure that's in parentheses, minus 4 times my a times my c, which are 1 and -9, all over 2 times 1. So then we get a positive 4, because negative and negative makes positive, plus or minus the square root. This time, when you type this into the calculator, you're going to get a number that's not a perfect square. And that number is 52, all over 2. So, because 52 is not a perfect square, the way we finish solving these questions are a little bit different. So we have to go to the side and break down this square root. I don't want you turning that into a decimal. So a few lessons ago, we learned how to simplify square roots. And you are looking for the largest perfect square that goes into 52. So go to your calculator and take 52. Now if you need me to write out some perfect squares, here they are. So take 52. You know 36 doesn't go into 52. You know 25 doesn't go into 52. So take 52 divided by 16. Not a perfect square. 52 divided by 9. Not a perfect square. 52 divided by 4 is 13. So we have the square root of 4 and the square root of 13. And I know that the square root of 4 is 2. So this simplifies to 2 square root of 13. So we just replaced that, the square root of 52 with 2 square root of 13. They're identical numbers. It's like saying 1/2 and 2/4. They're the same. And then the last step that we do is we look at these 3 numbers and see if we can divide them all by something. If they're all 3 of them, just those 3 numbers, not what's under the square root, those 3 that I have boxed in, we can divide by 2. And we're going to do that to make it more simplified. Now, if it's a 1, like this 1 radical 13, that's kind of like having 1x. You really don't have to write that. And then a 1 on the bottom, you don't have to write that either. So this is our final answer. We leave our answer with the plus or minus in it. You won't have 2 separate things. All right, number 6. Let's get it set equal to 0. So we have to subtract 4 from both sides. Now think for a minute. What are your A, B, and C values? Your A, that one you should get is -8. Some of you probably are going to say that your B is 3. However, remember your b is always what's in front of the x. Well, since there's no x here, your b is 0 and your c is 3. So it's going to be negative 0, which is just 0, plus or minus the square root of 0 squared minus 4 times my a, which is negative 8, times my c, which is 3. All over 2 times a, which is negative 8. All right, we have 0 plus or minus the square root. Now type those numbers into your calculator. And you should get 96 over negative 16. Now 96 is not a perfect square, so we're going to go break that down. Go to your calculator and figure out what the largest perfect square is that goes into 96. So you should be taking 96 divided by 64, 96 divided by 49, 96 divided by 36, 96 divided by 25, 96 divided by 16, and that's it. 16 and 6. And we know that the square root of 16 is 4. So the square root of 96 simplifies to 4 radical 6. Now, if there's a 0 in the very front, you don't even have to write that. Just plus or minus 4 radical 6 divided by negative 16. And then let's look at these numbers to see if I can divide them by anything. And they're both divisible by 4. So this will be plus or minus 1 radical 6 over negative 4. All right, number 7. Go ahead and get everything to one side. So get it set equal to 0. You should have 5x squared minus 4x plus 4. Now I want you to put that into the formula. when you get done, it should look like what I've got on the board. Now simplify. We have a positive 4 plus or minus the square root. And when you type those numbers in, you should get negative 64 all over 10. Now we need to simplify this square root of negative 64. Remember, when you have a negative, you have to pull that out first. And then that leaves you with the positive 64. What is the square root of negative 1? It's I. And the square root of 64 is 8. So we write that as 8i. You will come across some examples where this is not a perfect square, where you might have 8i radical 2. That's okay, you'll see those too. And you learned how to simplify those square roots. So this is 4 plus or minus 8i over 10. Now those three numbers, can you divide all three of those numbers by something? They're all divisible by 2. So if we divide them by 2, we have 2 plus or minus 4i over 5. And that's your final answer. I want you to try number 8 completely on your own. So pause the video and work out number 8. All right, you should have worked this one out. And we got negative x squared plus 10x minus 8. And I'm going to very quickly run through this and put this in the formula. So you can check to see if you got this one correct. So under the square root, you should have got 68. And the square root of 68 simplifies to 2 radical 17. 4 was the largest perfect square that went into it. And if we look at all three of those numbers, they're all 3 divisible by 2. So negative 5 plus or minus radical 17 over negative 1, or you could have done this. Positive 5 plus or minus radical 17. Either one is perfectly fine.